Welcome, my friend. The storm rages outside, but here, in the quiet of this story, I invite you to find peace. Let the sound of the rain and the distant thunder guide you as you drift into a place of calm. This story is my gift to you, a gentle companion for a night of restful sleep. Relax, let go of the day, and let the story carry you into dreams. David had been driving for hours, long, lonely hours, that blurred together in the monotonous hum of the truck's engine. The rain had started as a light drizzle, but now it was a torrential downpour that pounded against the windshield like tiny bullets. The wind rattled the truck, pushing it from side to side, but David was used to it. He'd been a long-haul trucker for years, the road's his second home. He wasn't bothered by the isolation. He actually preferred it. After all, the open road was where he could think, where he could escape the constant noise of the world. Tonight, however, something felt off. It wasn't the storm. He'd driven through worse. It wasn't the empty stretch of road, the fog creeping in on either side, or the shadows that seemed to reach toward him from the trees. It was something more subtle, something he couldn't quite place. David glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:34 a.m. Just a few more hours until he could stop for the night. He needed to make it to the truck stop a few miles ahead, refuel, grab a quick bite, and sleep for a while before hitting the road again. His eyes flicked back to the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, a deserted stretch of highway that seemed to stretch on forever. No other vehicles, no lights in the distance, just the soft flicker of the headlights cutting through the mist. It was then that he saw her. At first it was just a silhouette, barely visible in the heavy rain, standing on the side of the road. A figure, a woman. She was dressed in a tattered coat, her hair wet and matted against her face. Her back was to him, and the rain poured down in torrents. But David could make out her shape clearly against the dark backdrop of the highway. He thought about passing her, ignoring her, but the highway was desolate, and a hitchhiker this late at night. Something about her caught his attention. He couldn't quite explain why, but he felt a strange pull, like something wasn't right. Maybe it was the eerie calm in the storm, the fact that she was standing there, alone, in the middle of nowhere. He slowed down, his truck creeping toward her. As he neared, the woman turned around, and their eyes met. David felt his pulse spike, but not from fear. Not yet. No, it was something else. Something about her eyes, wide and dark, almost empty, seemed to pierce through him. She didn't smile. She didn't move, except to raise her hand, a silent gesture for him to stop. He did. He couldn't explain why. He just did. David rolled the window down, the cold air immediately rushing in, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something odd, like the smell of old earth. "Where are you headed?" David asked, his voice strained, more out of politeness than concern. The woman stood still, looking directly at him, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already stepping into the truck, as if it was expected. She slid into the seat, dripping wet, her eyes never leaving his. "Where are you headed?" David repeated, trying to shake the weird tension in the air. The woman blinked, her gaze unfaltering. "Just keep driving," she whispered, her voice low and hoarse, as though it had been worn down by time or sorrow. David froze for a moment, unsure whether he should continue or ask her to get out. He glanced at the road ahead, empty, quiet, no other cars in sight. Something about her made him uncomfortable, but he dismissed it. She was just a hitchhiker, nothing more. He wasn't the kind of guy to be scared by some stranger on the road. He pushed the truck into gear, and they continued down the highway. The rain started to pick up again, heavier now, as if the storm was responding to the strange presence in his truck. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour, and the road stretched on ahead, leading into darkness. They didn't speak for the longest time. The silence between them seemed to stretch longer with each passing mile, thicker, heavier. David glanced at her occasionally, but she just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. The silence grew suffocating, and David couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him. Her presence was cold, almost unnatural. Finally, David broke the silence. "You okay?" he asked, his voice more out of habit than concern. But the moment the words left his mouth, He regretted them. He wasn't sure why. The silence that followed felt even more unnatural. The woman shifted in her seat, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him shiver. She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "You shouldn't have picked me up." The truck's engine hummed steadily as the miles passed, but the silence inside the cab was anything but steady. David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he wasn't about to let this hitchhiker get into his head. He had seen all kinds of weird stuff on the road, from drunk drivers to angry truckers who yelled at the world like it owed them money. A lone woman in the rain? No big deal. Just another strange part of the job. So David said, trying to make small talk, his voice a little too loud in the quiet truck. "You been out here long?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward the window, staring out into the rain-swept night. David waited, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. Maybe she's just shy, he thought. Or maybe she was just really tired from the storm. "Long enough," she finally replied, her voice low and raspy. She didn't elaborate, but her words felt heavy, like there was more to them. David raised an eyebrow but decided not to push it. After all, it wasn't like he was here to make friends. "Yeah, well, I've been driving for about 12 hours straight. So if you need to keep quiet to keep yourself awake, I understand," he said with a half-hearted laugh. "Sometimes I talk to myself just to stay sane." He smiled at her, hoping for a chuckle, or even just a smile, anything to break the growing tension. But instead of laughing, she just stared at him, her gaze unblinking, and for a second David felt a chill run through him. He cleared his throat and returned his focus to the road. "Okay, weird, but no big deal. She's probably just tired. I'll turn on the radio." He flicked the dial, searching for anything to fill the silence. Static, static, more static. Great. The storm was interfering with the signal. He clicked the button to change the station again, but all he heard was more static. "Well, that's just fantastic," he muttered. "Guess we're stuck with my playlist then." He cleared his throat dramatically, as if preparing for a live show, and began to sing along to an old country tune. "She's got the eyes of an angel, but the heart of a..." "Stop." David froze mid-song. What? I don't want to hear that." She turned to him slowly, her face as serious as a person talking about taxes at a dinner party. "You're a little off-key." David stared at her for a long moment, blinking rapidly. "Oh, so we're doing that now? Okay, fine. I'll have you know I've been told by many a truck stop waitress that I'm a wonderful singer." He said the last part with a wink, hoping to lighten the mood, but her expression remained unchanged. "Truck stop waitresses," she muttered, almost to herself. "I bet they say that to everyone." David let out a breath through his nose, trying to hide his growing discomfort. "You know what? You're right. I'm terrible. I'll just stick to driving." He forced a smile, glancing over at her again. But this time, something in her gaze made him feel like he was missing a joke, or a warning. Something in her eyes was too still, like she wasn't really here, or worse, like she was waiting for something. Minutes passed in awkward silence, broken only by the rhythmic whoosh of the wipers battling the rain. David stole another glance at her. This time she was watching the dark road ahead, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't even tapping her fingers, which was weird in itself because anyone sitting in a truck for hours would have to move at least once in a while, right? "Okay, this is officially weird," David muttered under his breath. There was a small chuckle from the woman, a sound that startled him out of his thoughts. Finally, David said, forcing a smile, "I thought I was the only one with a sense of humor around here." "Humor?" she replied, her tone flat, but there was something almost amused about her expression. "What's funny about this?" David blinked. "I don't know, the fact that you're not saying a word and then bam, you crack a smile. It's like I'm in a horror movie, and the creepy hitchhiker is finally showing some emotion." He gestured out the windshield, the headlights flickering in the downpour. "I feel like any second, you're going to tell me you're not real, and I'm already dead, or something." She didn't answer immediately, just turned her head slightly to face him, her eyes dark and still, like deep wells of darkness. Then she leaned forward, her voice soft but carrying an unsettling weight. "Do you know what happens to the people who pick me up?" David chuckled nervously. I don't know, but if it's as bad as my driving, I'm probably gonna regret this." The woman smiled, a slow, unnerving grin that made his skin prickle. It wasn't a smile of humor. It was something else, something darker, The ones who picked me up, she said slowly, never make it home. The ones who picked me up, she said slowly, never make it home. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour, the storm now roaring in full force. David's truck swayed slightly as he drove, the tires gripping the slick road with each turn, while the headlights of the truck illuminated nothing but the unending rain and darkness. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something or someone was wrong. The woman beside him had been silent for what felt like hours now, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, never blinking. David's attempts to break the silence with small talk, with jokes, had faded away. Every time he spoke, it felt like she wasn't even listening. It was like she was somewhere else, like she wasn't really there at all. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The road was still empty, no other cars, just endless rain and the dim glow of the truck's headlights. The absence of other drivers made it feel more isolated, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that feeling, the feeling that the road, the storm, the woman beside him, were all part of some slow unfolding nightmare. So David said, trying to sound casual, "You from around here?" He shot a quick glance at her. She didn't answer, didn't even move. Her face was unreadable, like a mask. I mean, just wondering. You know, small talk, nothing. David let out a sigh, his fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. Man, it's weird, right? I thought I had a sense of humor, but you're like the living embodiment of a creepy horror movie. She finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost too soft, as though she was speaking from a distance. "I told you." David frowned, glancing over. "Told me what?" She turned her head toward him and he froze. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally wide, like someone who hadn't blinked in hours. It wasn't just the look of exhaustion. No, this was something else. It felt off. "I told you, David," she said again, her voice low. "You shouldn't have picked me up." David's pulse quickened. How did she know my name? He forced a laugh, a little too loud. "Oh, I get it. You're playing the role of the mysterious hitchhiker, right? You know, the one who warns the driver. But we all know what happens in those kinds of movies. The driver never listens, and the hitchhiker, well, they're usually not as creepy as you." Her lips twitched, almost like a smile, but there was no warmth in it, just a hint of something darker, something more dangerous. "Oh, David, I'm not here to play games." David swallowed hard, a chill running down his spine. He didn't want to show it, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His hands gripped the steering wheel even tighter. He glanced at the road again, trying to focus on something, anything, but the rain had become so thick, so oppressive, that it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The headlights reflected off the wet road, turning the whole world into a shimmering black mirror. He could barely make out the shape of the trees and the road signs in the distance. "Look," David said, his voice a little too shaky. "I know I picked you up, but this is getting a little strange. Okay? You're starting to freak me out a little." He tried to laugh it off, but his heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. "So, what's your deal? You some kind of ghost, serial killer, secret agent?" "I'm just asking because..." The woman cut him off. Her voice suddenly sharp and cold, cutting through his words. "You really don't understand, do you?" David's blood ran cold as he felt his stomach drop. Her eyes locked with those deep, dark eyes, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something else there. Not just coldness, not just emptiness, but something far worse, something predatory. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The air between them thickened, the weight of the silence pressing down on him like a physical force. The woman leaned closer to him, her face inches from his, her breath cold as the night air, brushed against his cheek. "You already made your choice, David," she whispered. "You shouldn't have picked me up." David's heart raced. He could feel the coldness of her breath against his skin, and his palms grew clammy on the wheel. His mind screamed at him to pull over, to kick her out, to just do something, but his body wouldn't obey. "What do you want from me?" he finally managed to rasp, his voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. Her smile grew wider, an unsettling hollow grin. I told you, you're mine now. The truck suddenly jerked, a violent lurch that almost sent David flying forward. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't slow down. The road ahead, it had changed. The familiar stretch of highway had disappeared, replaced by a winding, narrow road that he had never seen before. The trees on either side of the road seemed to bend toward him, their branches stretching out like fingers. David's eyes widened in panic as he slammed the brakes again, trying to regain control of the truck, but the tires screeched, and he was still being pulled forward, as if the road itself were refusing to let him stop. What's happening? David shouted, his voice panicked. What's going on? The woman didn't answer. She just sat there, her smile still stretched wide across her face, her eyes never blinking. And that's when David saw it, at the edge of the road, just beyond the trees, a faint flicker of light, a sign. He couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. It was the same sign, the one he had passed miles ago, the one that said, "Welcome to Sleepy Hollow." David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, but the truck kept moving, pulled forward, as if by some unseen force, some dark hand gripping the wheel. The road ahead, once so familiar, was now an alien stretch of twisted asphalt, curling and bending like a snake in the storm. The rain beat down harder than ever, but it wasn't the storm that chilled him. It was the woman sitting next to him, her presence now suffocating, oppressive. The flickering sign, the one that had been nothing more than a vague shape in the distance just moments ago, now loomed large in his windshield, clear and unmistakable. Welcome to Sleepy Hollow. It wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. Sleepy Hollow was a place from old stories, local legends. It didn't exist, but here it was, looming before him, its glowing letters mocking him, daring him to stop. Where are you taking me? David's voice cracked as he spoke, desperation lacing every word. He wasn't just afraid anymore. He was terrified. The woman next to him didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her eyes locked onto his, her lips curling into that same eerie, unblinking smile. She leaned in closer to him, her breath cold against his ear. You really don't get it, do you? Her voice was a soft whisper, but it felt like it echoed through his bones. This is where you belong now. You can't run. You can't hide. You're part of this now. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He tried to shake his head, to make sense of it all, but the storm was overwhelming. The road ahead endless. The truck wasn't stopping, no matter what he did. The woman's smile grew wider, more unsettling. You've driven into the heart of it now. The road, the storm, it's all alive. You're not in control anymore. And the road, it doesn't let you leave. David's breath caught in his throat. He felt the weight of her words settling over him, like a heavy blanket he couldn't shake off. The road was alive, the storm was alive. It was too much to process. His mind scrambled for answers, but there were no answers, only a growing, gnawing fear, a sense that this was just the beginning of something much worse. Suddenly the truck lurched again, harder this time, and David slammed his foot down on the brake. The tires screeched, the truck shuddered under his grip, but nothing changed. The road didn't stop, the storm didn't let up. It was all closing in on him, like the world itself was slowly suffocating him. Through the windshield, David could barely make out the shapes of trees, their twisted branches clawing at the air, moving unnaturally, like they were alive, reaching for him. He could hear them, their creaking limbs, groaning like something trapped in agony. No, he whispered, the words slipping out of his mouth before he could stop it. No, you're part of it now, she repeated, her voice low and almost gentle, like a lullaby. You can't leave. Not now. Not after you've seen it. David's hands trembled. His mind spun in circles, trying to rationalize what was happening. But it was useless. There was no escape. The road wasn't just a road. It was a trap. And somehow, in the depths of the storm, he had driven right into it. The wind outside howled louder, and the trees bent at unnatural angles, their shadows twisting like monstrous figures stretching toward him. The headlights flickered, the truck's engine stuttering as if it too was being pulled into the abyss. Why? Why are you doing this? David choked out, his voice barely above a whisper, his body shaking. She turned to him then, and her expression softened. For a moment she looked almost sad. It's not about why, David. It's about what. This is what happens to those who belong here. This is what happens to the ones who drive this road. You didn't listen. You never listened. David felt a chill crawl up his spine as her words sank in. The ones who belong here. Was he one of them now? The truck lurched again, and David could no longer control it. The wheel slipped from his hands, the storm outside howling as the truck veered wildly to the side. It felt like everything was spinning out of control. His breath, his mind, the truck itself, until finally, it slammed into something hard. Everything went black. The storm had passed. The rain had stopped. And when David opened his eyes again, the world was eerily calm, still and quiet. The truck sat motionless in the middle of the road, its engine dead, the headlights dimmed, flickering weakly in the night. David wasn't sure how long he'd been unconscious, but he knew one thing. The road was still there, and the woman, she was gone. But something remained. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, and something darker, something ancient. And as David sat there, his mind still trying to process the insanity of the last few hours, he knew that the road had marked him. He was part of it now, just like the others before him. And no matter how far he drove, the road would always be there, watching, waiting for its next victim. As he stepped out of the truck and looked down the empty highway, the familiar sign, "Welcome to Sleepy Hollow," glistened in the distant light, as if mocking him. David didn't know if he was ever going to escape. David sat motionless, his eyes still wide from the shock of what had just happened. The truck's engine was dead, its headlights dimmed, casting weak beams of light that flickered like dying stars. He tried to shake the fog from his mind, but the weight of what had just occurred, what he had just seen, refused to leave him. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, but it felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. He glanced around, the highway stretching out before him. But it was different now. The trees on either side, those twisted, gnarled shapes that seemed to move, seemed to bend toward him, their dark forms closing in. The world felt smaller, the road tighter. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all, but the thought only made the fear tighten its grip. I can't be the only one. He reached for the door handle and pulled it open, stepping out of the truck with legs that felt like they weren't his own, his body numb and heavy. The rain had stopped, but the dampness clung to his clothes, soaking through to his skin. His hands were cold as he slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively. But even then, he knew it wouldn't help. The wind was calm now, but the air still carried the scent of wet earth and something else, something darker, something that shouldn't have been there. David looked back toward the road, his gaze drawn to the sign in the distance. "Welcome to Sleepy Hollow." His heart skipped a beat. It was as if the sign had been waiting for him, beckoning him to this very spot. His feet moved on their own, walking slowly down the road, his mind still in a haze. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. There was no place left to go, no place that felt safe. His truck was gone, the woman was gone, and yet the presence of the road, the unshakable weight of it, still pressed in on him. "You shouldn't have picked me up." The words echoed in his mind, over and over again, louder than the sound of his own footsteps. The hitchhiker's voice was still with him, still pulling at him. He wanted to scream, to shout, but the words felt trapped in his throat, as if the air itself was keeping him from speaking. As he walked, he began to notice the shadows at the edge of the trees, shifting, moving closer. The branches seemed to stretch toward him, their twisted limbs now resembling fingers, reaching out, beckoning him forward. David froze, his breath catching in his throat as the trees seemed to close in on him. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken fear, the headlights flickered in the distance. David turned slowly, his body refusing to obey him as he looked down the road. In the distance, another truck, an old battered rig, appeared, The headlights blazed in the distance, illuminating the road ahead, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The sound of the engine echoed through the air. But it was different this time. It was too loud, too close, and as the truck grew nearer, David could see the figure in the driver's seat. A man, but not a man. His face was pale, distorted, his eyes wide and empty. The figure didn't blink, didn't move, just stared ahead, driving toward him with a force that made the air tremble. The headlights flared, brighter and brighter, and David's heart began to race again. Faster, harder. "No," David whispered, his voice trembling. "No, it can't be." The truck was upon him now, the tires screeching against the road, the headlights blinding him. As it came closer, closer until the whole world seemed to collapse under its weight. And then the truck passed. It drove right through him. David's body jerked back as if pulled by an invisible force, and he gasped for breath, his chest tight as if the air had been sucked out of him. The truck didn't stop. It didn't slow. It just kept going, disappearing into the fog, as though it had never been there at all. David stood in the middle of the road, his legs trembling beneath him. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as he stared at the spot where the truck had just passed. There was no sign of it now. No headlights, no engine sound, nothing. But there was a presence, an unmistakable weight in the air, something that watched, something that waited. And then, from the dark woods beside him, a voice whispered through the trees, "Welcome to Sleepy Hollow." David spun around, his breath quick and shallow, but there was nothing there. No hitchhiker, no truck, only the empty road, stretching on forever, under the same cold, suffocating sky. And then the sound of tires on asphalt. David turned just in time to see another truck approaching, its headlights burning through the fog, the rumble of the engine growing louder with each passing second. And in that moment, David knew. He knew that the road would never let him go. He would never escape. The road was alive. It had always been alive. And once you drove into its grip, once you became a part of it, there was no way out. The truck grew closer, and David was already gone. Sleepy Hollow remained as it always had, a quiet stretch of road, waiting for the next traveler, the next victim, to pass through its grasp. The storm had passed, but the road was still there, alive, watching, waiting. And when the next weary driver stopped to pick up a hitchhiker, they too would learn the true price of the road.